is medicine about quality of life, or is it about like social control and perpetuating this idea of like a good body?
Ableism is the bane of my motherfucking existence. Ableism is, it's funny because people are like, oh, I'm so sorry that you're disabled. And it's absurd. I kind of want people to be like, oh, I'm so sorry that we live in ableism and I'm perpetuating it every day. Like, that's an appropriate thing to feel shitty about.
I think there's a political understanding of ableism as a system of oppression that favors able-bodiedness at any cost, frequently at the expense of people with disabilities. And I think ableism touches every aspect of life. Earlier, you were talking about internalized ableism and all of these values that people with disabilities adopt and carry shame, and it's like so heavy, such a heavy coat, you know? And then I think there's ways ableism gets played out interpersonally between non-disabled people and people with disabilities. We know that the employment rate for people with disabilities has barely shifted over the last 40 years. We know so many people with disabilities are still locked away in institutions or in back rooms. So there's that interpersonal and systemic piece, and then also the institutional ableism. So what systems are in place that continually keep people with disabilities out? There's a lot of conversation to be had too, I think, about all the ways that ableism and racism and classism and heterosexism and all forms of oppression like really work together to keep people out.
So understanding autism as a part of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity, neuro meaning the brain and nervous systems, diversity meaning a mixture of everybody and every type of brain and nervous system. When we think about biodiversity, it appears that the human race has a really challenging time appreciating that we are all different and we all need different things. And we seem to be the only species on the planet that struggles with this. Animals, as an example, can absolutely learn to live together despite, and actually not despite, but because of their differences, their environments often flourish. The same as flora, which is what we're focusing on today. Autism or neurodivergence as a birthright. So the social model of disability is really important. Firstly, I want to say that as an autistic person, I completely reject the notion that I am disordered. I steer clear of terminology such as ASD or autism spectrum disorder when referring to myself or my neurokin, others who are autistic as well. I do this as a sign of respect to myself and others because I'm avoiding calling people disordered. Even though it may be what textbooks say about me, I have the right to choose how I show up in the world and how I identify, and I reject the idea that I am a disorder. Am I disabled, however? Yes, absolutely. Is autism a disability? 100%. Under the social model of disability, what we're looking at is how well supported, understood, and accommodated an autistic person is by their environment and others around them. An example of the social model of disability is for an autistic person being in a shopping centre and having the lights dimmed and the music turned down. That is one example of so many. In comparison to the medical model, which places the responsibility of disability solely with the individual. So we might say, okay, you're autistic, but you need to accommodate yourself. So if you're going to go to the shopping centre, wear headphones, go at a particular time of day when it's quieter, which many of us are really accustomed to doing anyway. Understanding that co-occurring conditions are not autism or just a part of being autistic. So examples of that may be anxiety or gastrointestinal distress or having mental illness or depression. these things are not just a part of being autistic, they are co-occurring conditions, which means that they are really common conditions that autistic people have or can develop, and often they are a result of not being well supported, not having our support needs identified according to the unique individual. And again, disability as a naturally occurring variation of human. So there are so many forms of disability in the world. And when we think about autism specifically, it's interesting to consider that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of autistic people in the world, whether they're identified or not, and then to continue to consider autistic people as disordered or deficit-based seems really odd to me, because we are a population of people that share commonalities. And although we may share commonalities that tend to be viewed as deficits, for us, more often than not, when those challenges are addressed and supported, we have the ability to thrive. Hence, understanding the difference between treating autism and supporting the individual. Sometimes the only understanding or information that we've been exposed to is that we need treatment. But it is important to focus on the individual and knowing that we have fluctuating support needs. So we will not have the same needs in adulthood that we have in childhood. We may not have the same needs next week that we have this week. Also, understanding that there is often this idea that because we're autistic, we have this generic framework of supports applied to us, which can be a speech pathologist, an occupational therapist, a psychologist, and maybe some other form of therapy. But there is every possibility that we may not need all of those things. So coming back to the understanding that we support the individual based on their needs in any given moment. So avoiding applying a generic framework. Using interests as aspirations, not economy, and not for reward or punishment. So there are therapies that will encourage us to focus on our children's interests and use them to encourage the child to be compliant with what we want them to achieve or be, or skills we want them to develop. It's not okay to use our children's or have our own interests used as a commodity. Using those interests to assist our children or to help ourselves find our autistic peers, our community, is more helpful than anything. So immersing ourselves in our interests can actually lead us to our peer networks. Understanding that there are developmental differences. There's no secret about that for autistic folks. I want to encourage families to remember that autistic folks, we are on our own timeline of development. We are going to take time to reach milestones, because for us, there is so much going on in this incredibly engaging world. There's so much to look at and to study and to smell and to hear and to feel energetically. It takes us so much time to process sensory input, to learn language, to watch human beings, the way that we have social dynamics. As autistic folks, we are taking all of this stuff in all of the time. And so taking that into account and understanding that we need additional processing time. We need additional time to develop, for our brains to develop, for our learning pathways to be discovered. This is so important. We understand that we do differently, not dysfunctionally. It is so easy for people to look in on autistic culture and identity and compare it to non-autistic culture and identity or family life, and to make the judgment that we live dysfunctionally, that our play is not functional play. And when we think about that example for a moment, play comes from the imagination. Play comes from experimentation with our environment and the way we relate to our environment. And knowing that autistic folks, we relate differently to people, places and things, our environment, we're taking in all that information and making sense of it. There's no such thing as functional or non-functional play. Our play is just as joyful, however it looks. So it's important to not compare autistic culture and lifestyle to non-autistic culture and lifestyle. It means that we may need less time in community. We may need to eat our foods differently. Our engagement with technology may be different. We may need more screen time because it's grounding for us, because it's regulating, because it allows us to safely judge social situations and learn our place in social dynamics from a safe place. We have varying yet shared commonalities around psychosocial needs and preferences. It's taking the pressure off from attempting to be who we are not. And improved mental health and well-being outcomes is often the result of autistic culture and lifestyle. Exploration of autistic identity and what that means, not in comparison to non-autistic people. It's about embracing and understanding ourselves as autistic individuals and knowing that we are perfectly whole autistic people and not broken versions of non-autistic people. Recognizing the importance of neurodivergent exploration that also challenges our internalized ableism. So remembering that earlier I was talking about many autistic folks internalizing ableism. What that means is seeing ourselves as less than, seeing ourselves as broken or inherently flawed because of the messaging we've received from society. Am I really weak, lazy, oversensitive, blunt, intense, scattered? Or is it time to consider myself through a different lens? The lens of acceptance, a more loving and kind, self-forgiving, self-compassionate lens of acceptance. Is a daisy a disordered rose with odd yellow petals that need to be morphed into another colour, texture and smell? How might a daisy cope if we threw fertiliser on it and pruned it back heavily with shears every winter? They're beautiful, bright, and able to be nurtured to thrive exactly as they are. It's important to understand communicative and social differences. An autistic person is not necessarily a deficited version of somebody communicating or a disordered version. So there is a body of research growing that reflects that when autistic people are in community, we seldom struggle in communication with one another. We tend to understand one another intuitively and energetically. But when we come into contact with non-autistic people socially, there is an unspoken recognition of communication gaps that need to be bridged. And more often than not, the responsibility for that bridge is given to the autistic person to work harder at communicating with non-autistic peers. Understanding that autism is an identity and culture helps us to understand that an autistic person and a non-autistic person in communication is a cultural mismatch. It's like taking two people from two different countries that speak two completely different languages and understanding that it's because there's a language barrier, not because one language is right and the other is wrong, or one language is neuronormative and the other is disordered. It's not about that at all. It's about a cultural mismatch. I have thrived far more from being immersed in autistic community, from being educated by autistic folks, than engaging in medical textbooks written by non-autistic people that are based on biased observation of our behaviour. Cultivating a lifestyle that incorporates safety, safe people, safe places, and safe things. Because over time, when we are surrounded by safety and support and nurturing environments, we are able to then practice self-advocacy. We tend to get really great and really skilled at knowing and identifying our support needs and speaking up when we need help.